Well, if it isn't my favorite little pupil, are you back to listen to another lecture? You're always so attentive. Well, recently, I've been reading up on Lugh and Balor. They come from Irish mythology. Does that sound interesting? Okay, have a seat. So, Lugh and Balor, they are very important figures in Celtic lore, actually. Kind of like some of the figures that I've told you about in the past. Their story is all about a final fight between the old and the new order. Almost like a fight between light and darkness. It's pretty cool. So, let's start with Balor. He is this, like, one-eyed, tyrannical king of the Fomorians, which are these destructive, chaotic beings that are associated with the usual chaos themes that you find in mythology. You know, darkness, death, that kind. Basically, they're giants, known as those who occupied Ireland years and years ago. In other words, Balor is basically a giant cyclops. Literally. So, he's big and he's got this one giant eye, and his giant eye is his most deadly weapon. Which, I know. How can someone kill you with an eye? Well, it turns out that anything that he would see would die or wither away, at least according to myth. Basically, his eye was huge and heavy-lidded and was sealed shut. If for whatever reason it ever needed to be opened, it would require about 4 warriors with hooks or poles to try to pry it open during battle. Now, in fantasy, not saying that this isn't, but you know what I mean. Most people hear the phrase death eye and probably think of like some eye that shoots out a beam or a laser that will literally turn you to dust, but this eye apparently doesn't do that, depending on what sources you read. Like, it still does that, but not the laser part. So, the eye itself, when opened, it would scorch the land, or it would wither crops, or it could kill warriors instantly, or even cause diseases or blights. And I know the scorching part kind of sounds like a laser beam, but trust me, it isn't. Like, imagine if you woke up and you burned a hole through your ceiling just because you opened your eyes. Anyway, in some versions of the story, the eye shoots out this, like, poisonous energy or a burning light, but in other texts, it just says that anything that the eye looks at will die or decay. So imagine you have a flower in front of you, and if you open your eyes to look at it, it just dries out and withers. So, like I said, it kind of depends on what source you read. The closest thing to a beam that there ever was in any of these stories was more of like an aura than a beam of light. But, I mean, I'd say that's kind of the same thing. Still, I'm more inclined to think it's like the Medusa stare. You know, the snake woman with snake hair that would turn people to stone if they stared at them. Anyway. This eye was so destructive. It had to have, like, 9 layers of skin over it to prevent it from wreaking havoc. Because once the eye itself was fully opened, it would annihilate anything in its path. Anyway, enough about Balor and his evil eye, at least for now. Let's move on to Lugh. So, Lugh was this young god of the Tuatha De Danann. Their name basically means the folk of the goddess Danu. In other words, they're a pantheon of gods of this land. As for Danu, there's actually not too much that we know about her, but I'll look more into her later and let you know if I find just anything interesting. Anyway, Lugh represents the opposite that Balor does. He specifically represents light, arts, war, and sovereignty. He was known as Lugh Lamfada. I couldn't find an actual pronunciation for it, so I'm kind of guessing here. So basically, he's Lugh of the Long Arm. Like, that's his full name. He also excels in every craft and skill. He's this divine polymath, aka someone who knows a lot about many, many, many things, and is at a level beyond that of an expert. And of course, he's a solar figure. In other words, a sun god, since he represents light and all. So, he's very, 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 very important to the Celtic pantheon. Anyway, there was a prophecy involving Lugh's future birth. Basically, Balor would be killed by his own grandson. So, to prevent this, Balor imprisoned his daughter, Inu, in a tower. But she still gets pregnant by Cian, a warrior of the pantheon. And she then gives birth to Lugh and raises him in secrecy to protect him from Balor's wrath. Lugh is often referred to mostly as Simuldanach, which just means possessor of all arts, or someone who's very good at everything. When he approaches the pantheon for the first time, they deny him entry until he proves that he's more than just a warrior, but that he's also a poet, a harpist, a smith, craftsman, physician, and magician. Once the gatekeeper realizes who he's talking to, they let him in. Unlike most warrior gods, which are usually just brash and violent, he specifically relies on tactics and leadership, using his cleverness and charisma. But that doesn't mean that he can't be rough when he needs to. He had this strong spear, known as the Spear of Asal, which no enemy could withstand. Some sources would describe it as being so hot, it would need to be stored in a container full of water so that it wouldn't burn everything. He is also the grandfather of Cuchulainn, another Irish hero that I might tell you about later. But anyway, skipping ahead a little bit, the Fomorians, being evil and all, oppress the pantheon, and Lugh rises up to lead them to battle. During this battle, a few things happen depending on your source, but basically, Balor opens his evil eye and kills everything in its path. Lugh then uses a sling or a spear to strike Balor in the eye, which pushes it out of his skull, which is mondo grody, or, sorry, it's quite grotesque. Anyway, the eye ends up looking at the Fomorians, which basically results in them dying, and like the prophecy said, Lugh kills his grandfather, and the Fomorians are defeated. Pretty neat, huh? Compared to some of the other myths I've told you about, this one was pretty gruesome in its climax, but very interesting nonetheless, I think. A lot of people know about European mythology, but not many focus or study those of Ireland or the Celts for some reason. Even ancient English ones are very different, like Gogmagog, who was this like ancient giant that lived in Britain. Well, I mean, there's a lot of giants in European myth, if I'm honest. But I can tell you more about those next time, when I read up on them again. Okay? Did you enjoy my mini lecture? Well, thank you for always being here, listening to me talk about stuff that interests me. It always makes me a bit happier, having someone hear me talk about stories or myths. I wonder what I should read for next time. Hmm. Well, that's something you'll just have to wait to hear, huh? Oh, hey, what's up? Hmm? Oh, I see. You saw me reading, and you got curious again, huh? Would you like to know what I was reading about this time? Yes? Alright, come on. I'll tell you a bit about what I was reading about. So, this time I was reading up on another classic, Norse mythology, mainly looking into Thor and Loki's relationship. So, if you've been paying attention to our past talks, you might have noticed that I've been looking into various opposing forces. Usually one good and one quote unquote evil, or if not good and evil, then one side that wants to do something, and the other being, well, there to oppose it, or even if it's just two literal opposites. Anyway, I'm sure you're a bit familiar with them since Norse gods are pretty popular in modern media, but I'll tell you more about them anyway, since you're so interested. Let's start with Thor. So, he's the Norse god of, thunder and lightning and storms and the like. I'm sure you know. He's a literal thunder god. But he's also the god of oak trees, strength, fertility, while also being the protector of mankind, like that Amon Amarth song says. Anyway, he's one of the more popular deities in his pantheon. Even back in the day, commoners knew of him, and so did many, many warriors. Now, Thor is the son of Odin, or as he's known, Volden, the Allfather, and his mother, Earth, which is the personification of Earth. And you can even hear it in her name, which in English means Earth. And I mean, that's what it sounds like too. Anyway, this is the connection he has to the mortal world as a god himself. There's quite a few different depictions of him, but his main traits, at least that most people agree upon, are how brawny he is, and that he has red hair and a beard. In battle, he is very fierce, but also very straightforward and loyal. Sometimes he's depicted as being very simple-minded. So he basically just knows how to do battle, and he's kind to those that he likes. Unlike some other gods and other pantheons, which resolve their problems with tactics or wit, as we've heard about before, he usually prefers to resolve things with his hammer, Mjolnir. And, I mean, it's not that Thor is, like, an idiot or something, but, like, why talk things out when you can literally just smash your opponent to bits in some cases? Anyway, speaking of Mjolnir, it's probably his most iconic weapon. It's a hammer, and anytime he throws it, it always comes back to him. But it's not just a weapon of war, as it's also used in wedding ceremonies or even when, during births. By this I mean symbolically, as in they have the symbol of Thor's hammer somewhere in the vicinity, either, in the chapel or, well, wherever the marriage is taking place, or even where the baby's being delivered. This doesn't mean that, Thor himself is delivering the baby for you. There is also Mainjörð, which is a belt that he wears, which doubles his strength. And we also have Járngrip, which is literally iron grabber. And those are his gloves that he wears to wield Mjolnir properly. He also has a chariot that is pulled by two goats of all things. His two goats being Tangrisnir and Tangjurst. It might sound a bit funny that he has goats pulling his chariot, unlike other gods who might have, horses. But in Norse mythology, it's not too uncommon. I mean, there's also the goddess Freyja, who has her chariot pulled by cats, of all things. Anyway, so Thor is mainly the chief protector of Asgard, which is where the gods live, and Midgard, where humans live. He is constantly fighting Jotnar, or giants, who are chaotic and they destroy everything. Despite being a god, however, he does like to travel through the realms like a wandering warrior who protects the weak and slays monsters for fun. He is, however, fated to die in Ragnarok, which is the Nordic apocalypse, the end of the world. He's supposed to fight and kill Jormungand, the world serpent. Basically, the Norse believed in the ocean there was this huge snake that wrapped around the world, which is kind of terrifying. But it dies, and Thor then dies to its venom after he kills it. Loki, on the other hand, is much different. His father is Farbauti, a giant, thus making Loki a giant as well. But he lives amongst the gods due to this blood pact that was made with Wotan. He is the Norse god of trickery, deception, shapeshifting, mischief, and unlike most gods, Loki doesn't really have a moral compass that he follows. Instead, he just acts on a whim or self-interest. He's very charismatic and manipulative, but also clever and funny. He ends up playing a lot of pranks and changes forms often. In some stories, he's been depicted as having transformed into a fish or a mare and the like. And sometimes he will come to the aid of gods who need saving, but he will also contribute to their downfall in many cases. He's also had a few children, which are all kind of weird. One of those kids is Fenrir, which is this giant wolf that's fated to kill Wotan during Ragnarok. And then we have Jormungand, again, the world serpent fated to kill Thor. Then we have Hel, and that's spelled H-E-L. And she is the ruler of the underworld. Their name is probably pronounced more like Hel. But anyway. Oh, and remember how I mentioned that he turned into a mare? A female horse? Well, somehow, Loki gets pregnant. And then he gives birth to Sleipnir, which is an 8-legged horse whom he then gives to Volden. So he's quite the character, huh? Either way, there's some notable stories involving Loki, one of them being Loki's wager, where he tricks a dwarf known as Brokkr, and basically, he makes a bet and loses. In the bet, he wagers his head, but when the dwarf comes to collect his debt, which is his head, Loki says he can have his head, but not his neck, which is kind of funny, since, well, Loki has parts that belong both to the head and the neck, and then neither side can really come to an agreement on where the head starts and the neck ends. So Loki got to keep his head at the end of the day, and this story has since been described as a fallacy being, an argument with faulty reasoning as the construction of said argument, and it may appear as, a valid argument if you're not paying attention. But yeah, if you end up looking more into it, it'll be, Loki's wager, and that's the name of the fallacy itself, and it's based on this story, which is pretty interesting. Anyway, he's also responsible for the death of Bath, or as you might know him, Balder, one of the most beloved gods of all, who basically tricked the blind god Hoth into throwing a mistletoe, which was the only thing that could harm him, and, that results in his death, which is a bit weird, I know, but anyway. After killing Bath, however, Loki tries to get away. He's captured, and he ends up being bound beneath the earth, while a serpent hangs above him, and it's dripping venom into his face. His wife, Seon, tries to catch the venom in a bowl, but when she empties it, the drops fall, and they cause Loki to scream and squirm in agony. And as he's writhing around, this is what was believed to have caused earthquakes, since Loki is imprisoned literally underneath the earth. Still, during Ragnarok, he escapes his bonds and leads the giants and monsters of this world against the gods. He eventually dies in battle with Heimdall, another important god, and both end up killing each other. In some stories, Thor and Loki do adventure and travel together, but both are two completely different contrasting entities. Thor, however, is direct and honest and physical, while Loki is clever, manipulative, and verbal or psychological. Thor defends the gods, while Loki destroys them, and Thor is also usually just a straight man in a situation, while Loki's chaos tends to lead to, well, chaotic or ironic endings. They were friends at one point, but, that friendship would be tested often. And with the death of Bath, that friendship ends permanently. I mean, you end up killing a god that everyone likes. It's not going to end well, right? Still, you usually do see a complementary nature to them, where Loki's wit complements Thor's brute strength, while Thor provides the muscle to enable Loki's schemes. And they're definitely quite the pair, huh? To think that so much time has passed and these figures still live on, like, to this day, is pretty incredible. It's a true sign of divinity and immortality. Their flesh and bones might be gone from this world, but their ideas, stories, and visages still exist as if nothing has changed. And this is why I love literature and mythologies. They provide such an insight to a world that's long gone, but they also give us stories to learn from. Maybe in the future, I'll tell you about some of the actual stories from around the world. And maybe you can see some of the parallels found between those stories and maybe some of these Nordic ones. But still, did you enjoy my rambling? Well, I'm glad you still had fun. Norse myth is one of my favorites, so maybe we'll come back to it some more later, okay? Until next time, my little pupil. Didn't see you there. Well, you saw me reading just now, so I assume you want a little lecture from me. Alright, come on. This time I was reading up on Ahriman and Ahura Mazda from Zoroastrian mythology. Their dynamic is one of the oldest and earliest recorded examples of the generic good versus evil archetype that we have in most religions. Zoroastrianism is from ancient Persia, and it was founded by a prophet whose name was Zarathustra around 1500 BCE and 600 BCE. There's no real concrete date, but, it was also 3,000 years ago, so I don't blame anyone for not being 100% sure. Anyway, the main conflict in this pantheon involves Ahura Mazda, aka the Wise Lord, and Angra Mainyu, or Ahriman, aka the Destructive Spirit. Mazda was this supreme creator god of light and wisdom, truth and goodness. He was associated with the sun, fire, and eternal light. And all of these elements, of course, are associated with divine order. Mazda is also the embodiment of Asha, the cosmic principle of order, truth, and righteousness. Mazda basically created the spiritual and physical worlds, was the source of all good, while also working to keep the peace and granted humans free will, or the free will to choose between good, Asha, and evil, Drush, aka the lie. Not sure about that pronunciation, I'm just gonna go with Drush, but because it sounds correct, but anyway. Just remember that Asha is good, Druj is evil, right? Or, lying and stuff. He is often depicted as this radiant figure, or appears as if they're within a winged disc known as the Farabahar. Imagine a bird's wings stretched outward, horizontally, with a gold disc or a ring in the middle, and below the ring is a bird's tail feathers, and in the center, you have the figure of a man. This is supposed to be Mazda, and it's there to represent divine guidance and the eternal soul. Ahriman, on the other hand, is a destructive spirit and the embodiment of chaos, deceit, and evil. He is associated with winter, disease, and death, and, so on. He also seeks to undermine Asha through Druj, so defeat good through lies and disorder. He was responsible for creating these evil spirit creatures known as Daivas to oppose the divine order created by Mazda. He also corrupts creation by introducing things like death and suffering into the world, as well as being a literal antagonist. He is actively trying to corrupt others and the world. Ahriman is also rarely depicted in Zoroastrian art, so as to avoid glorifying and giving him more influence/power. Throughout history, however, he has been shown to look like a monstrous creature, either reptilian or kind of like a shadow. So, what's their deal? That's when we get to the invasion. Basically, at the dawn of time, we have two realms, that of light and darkness, Mazda's and Ahriman's respectively. Mazda foresees that Ahriman will one day attack, and instead of destroying him, he creates a finite 12,000-year-old cosmic timeline to trap his actions and to ensure an eternal victory. So here's how this plays out. Ahriman sees the creation of everything when Mazda manifests the spiritual prototype of creation known as Menog. Basically, this is the perfect blueprint. Ahriman gets a glimpse of its beauty and goodness through the void and becomes enraged. He literally cannot stand anything that he cannot corrupt. So he crosses the void, breaking through the boundary between realms, which begins the invasion. This, of course, shocks all of creation, as the realm of light had been untouched by darkness until right now. Remember, Ahriman does not create. He can only corrupt what already exists. Ahriman unleashes his daivas, remember, the evil spirits, and Druj, the corruption and disease and so on. These forces he unleashes attack a lot of the spiritual prototypes in this mythology. Things like the primordial bull, which is killed, but his death leads to the creation of all beneficent animals. He also kills the first human, Gaiomart, but this leads to the creation of humanity. As you can probably tell, everything that Ahriman does leads to something else, and this was all part of Mazda's plan. His evil actions, the killings and so on, lead to further Mazda's creations. So think of evil undermining itself. So to protect the spiritual prototypes, Mazda condenses them into a physical form, Getig, creating the material universe. Ahriman is then trapped inside for those 12,000 years. The sun and stars end up acting like cosmic guardians that keep the cycles moving towards the final restoration, or frashokeretti. In case you're wondering, the spiritual prototypes are, like the name implies, spiritual or ghostly blueprints of everything. Literally everything. From mountains, the earth, trees, leaves, birds, everything. It's their first iterations. Since Mazda knew Ahriman was going to attack, he made it so the fight would be limited. Anything evil would result in a greater good being created from it, and eventually Ahriman would be rendered powerless at the end of the battle. Zoroastrianism has this worldview where it's dualistic, meaning that the universe is divided into two, good and evil. And said universe is a battlefield for those forces of good and evil. Some mythologies like to teach that evil is forever eternal and stuff like that. You know, evil never dies or evil never goes away. But Zoroastrianism, they claim that Mazda is eternal and will eventually win. Ahriman, however, has a limited lifespan, meaning that he will be destroyed at the end of time. Speaking of, the end of time victory, or their apocalypse, I guess, is known as Frashokeretti, where the world is purified, the dead are resurrected, and all evil is eliminated forever. Humans, of course, do participate in this cosmic struggle, where all of our actions, thoughts, words, everything support either Asha or Druj. In it, ethics are very action-oriented, where good works actively weaken Ahriman's influence. Pretty cool, huh? It's quite something to explore ancient mythologies and seeing some of these parallels with our modern times. Imagine if this was like the true religion, and we're just waiting for the 12,000-year-old cycle to end, just so that evil can finally die off and everyone can be reborn. Or maybe it's better if that didn't happen. Still, if I read up on more cool stuff, I'll let you know. Did you enjoy my rambling again? Good. I'm glad I'm not boring you with these, but thank you for being as attentive as ever. You really are my star pupil, you know?